Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. The day had baked itself into the earth. Heat lifted from the plains in slow, glassy waves, and the grasshoppers rasped like 1,000 tiny saws. Clara kept to the wagon ruts where the ground packed hard and the going was easier on her boots. The leather at the toes had split months ago. Snowmelt on the Laramie had done that, and she'd stuffed the gaps with cloth, but it didn't keep the dust out. Nothing did. Dust found you and stayed, like old troubles. She carried all she owned in a canvas roll tied with twine. A spare shirt, a coil of line, a flint, a tin spoon, and the small sewing kit that kept her in work when the towns would have. In the crook of her arm rode a dented kettle she'd picked from a pile behind a burned-out chuck wagon. She'd scrubbed the soot and made it shine again. She liked things that could be coaxed back to purpose. By mid-afternoon, the wind changed. It slid off the hills, hot as a forge, and carried a smell Clara knew too well. Not sage, not cook's smoke bitter, hungry. Fire. She stopped on a rise and shaded her eyes. To the west, a single column climbed into the sky, tight and dark. At the center, fraying at the edges as the heat spread it thin. Not a grass fire. Too straight. A homestead, maybe. Or a trapper's place. She angled off the trail. The country folded there into shallow coulees and sandy swales dotted with rabbit brush. As she dropped into the first hollow, sound came to meet. The crack and sigh of burning timber, a deep groan like an animal in pain when a beam gave way. She moved faster, skidding down the sandy slope, boots finding purchase in patches of buffalo grass, kettle thumping against her hip. The cabin sat where a finger of creek bent and widened into a slow pool. Whoever had built it had chosen well water close at hand, a cottonwood for shade, a line of rock for shelter from the north winds. A washing line strung between two posts still held a shirt, its sleeves blackening and curling in the heat. The roof had gone up first pitch-slick shingles, snapping like dry bones, and now the walls burned bright, orange light pulsing at the seams. "Hello?" She called, throat tightening on the word. "Hey, anybody inside?" The fire hissed. Something collapsed and a cough of sparks rose, drifted, and fell like red snow. Clara skirted the front, one arm up to guard her face. The door leaned at a bad angle, a fallen crossbar pinning it. Through a gap she saw the room like flashes in a storm. A table, a bunk, a hanging pot. On the earthen step lay a doll, cornhusk hair singed down to a crisp black fringe. "Hey!" She shouted louder. "You need help?" No answer. She tried. The door and burned her palm. She bit back a sound, tucked the injured hand under her arm, and ran for the creek. She dumped her shawl, the faded blue cotton turning near black, and slung it over her head and shoulders. In the water her burned hand throbbed. She told it to hush and filled the kettle besides. On the way back, she snagged a blanket off the wash line half charred and dunked that too. Wrung it as she ran so it wouldn't drip and steam her blind. She pressed the wet blanket across the gap by the door to keep the fire's breath from rushing at her, then wedged her shoulder against the tilted jamb. The soaked cotton hissed. Smoke licked around its edges and rolled into her face. She dropped low and kicked, once, twice, the heel of her good boot hitting solid. The crossbar shifted. On the third try, it gave enough that a person who didn't mind splinters could slide through. Clara minded splinters about as much as she minded the dust. She pulled the shawl tight across her mouth and belly-crawled under the jammed door and into the dim, roaring heat. Inside, the smoke flattened everything. It took the edges off, shape and sound. The world narrowed to the floor beneath her, and a bright river of orange that ran the wall where the chinking had fallen out. She could see only a little ahead. She felt more than saw the table, the chair, the lard crock that toppled and spread its contents like a slick tongue. She pushed past it, hands sweeping to find a person, an ankle, a sleeve, a breath dot. At first she thought the thin sound she heard was the fire itself whining as it ate. It broke into a sharp, high wail that didn't belong to the flames. A baby. The sound came from the back corner near the bunk. Clara crawled toward it, bumping her shoulder on a chest, knocking her knee on a low stool. Sparks dropped from the rafters and nipped at the back of her neck. She found the bunk by running into it face first. The wet shawl dragged across her. Nose and brought tears, good tears, ones that kept the smoke from burning her eyes to ash. The cradle had tipped. She could tell by the way the cry sawed in and out. It came from somewhere at an angle, lower than it should be. She swept with her hands and found a wooden rail hot enough to make her flinch. She shoved, got her fingers under the slats, and righted it. Inside, a bundle squirmed, wrapped in deerskin, the top of a tiny head slick with sweat. Two dark eyes stared up wide and glassy with panic. "I've got you," Clara said, though her voice came out ragged and thin in the smoke. She lifted the bundle, surprised by the weight. The blanket stitching caught at her fingers small, neat triangles in red and blue, the work careful and sure. It was an old kind of pattern, the kind she'd seen on the shoulders of women who passed the settlements with their families in springtime, moving with the seasons like the buffalo used to dot another beam, popped somewhere overhead. The rafters shifted. The cradle groaned as a coal fell through a gap and landed where the baby's head had just been. The room brightened in a sick way that told her the roof was going, and when it went, it would go all at once. She tucked the bundle tight into her coat, turned onto her elbows and hips, and backed the way she'd come, dragging one leg to keep her profile low. The kettle she'd abandoned on the floor hissed and jumped as water boiled out of it. Her burned hand screamed against the baby's weight. She told it again to hush. Halfway to the door, she found the crossbar with her shoulder instead of her eyes. For a moment it felt immovable as bone. Then she remembered the blanket. She seized the edge, pulled, and the wet fabric slid and fell. Smoke roared into the gap so hard it pushed at her like a physical thing. She planted her boots, shoved with her back, and the door frame gave a little. She rolled on her side, wedged her heel against the jamb, and heaved. The opening widened just enough to get a forearm through. She put the baby first. Always first. The bundle slid out onto the step. Clara followed, anchoring her ribs in the frame, and pushing until suddenly there was nothing beneath her, and she spilled onto the hard-packed clay. She wrapped her arms around the bundle and curled, instinct trumping sense, as the roof finally let go and fell inside with a crash that blew smoke and sparks into the blue afternoon. The sound rang in the shallow basin like thunder breaking right over your head. For a moment, all she could do was lie there and breathe the clean part of the day. The baby's crying had changed. It came now, in short, wet bursts, the kind that said more fear than pain. Clara sat up, slid toward the creek on her backside, and dumped a corner of her shawl again, wringing it out with her good hand. She wiped the child's face and nose gentle as a whisper. Soot streaked the cloth. She tipped her palm and let a few drops of water touch the infant's lips. Nothing. More enough to cool, not to drown. The little mouth worked. The eyes, big as a fawn's, tracked her. "You did fine," she said, not sure who she meant. "We did fine." The cabin itself was now a box of flame open to the sky. Smoke rose straight up. The wind had dropped too. Nothing as if even it didn't want to meddle. Clara scanned the yard for any sign of others. Behind the cabin, a pen held a single goat, bleeding sporadically at the sudden loud world. Its tether had burned through, and it paced, rope trailing. The chopping block dripped sap from a fresh-cut round. On a line by the door hung a pouch of dried berries, scorched but edible. She saw a skillet, a shovel, a boot. No people. She tucked the child, still half sobbing, half hiccuping, under the shade of the cottonwood, and set about what needed doing. She freed the goat first and let it nose along the creek to drink. The shadows already had an edge to them that said evening would come quick if you busied yourself. She found the well, dropped the bucket, and drew up water that tasted of iron and salvation. The pump's handle had a fresh wrap of leather to keep from blistering the hand. Someone had been careful here. She stripped off her burned shawl, dunked it, and lay it over her neck to soothe the sting she'd only now started to feel. When the worst of the fire settled to a hot black stutter, she moved closer, scanning again for any shape that shouldn't be there. She called into the heat like someone taking roll. "Hey, anyone?" The words went up and away. Nobody answered them, and the only voices left were the pop of coals and the goat's low complaint. Clara swallowed. She'd made it out of other people's disasters before. She knew the shape of the quiet that followed. Them. Still, she circled the ruins once, twice, peering in where the walls had fallen flat. Near the doorway, something bright caught her eye, half buried in ash. She used the shovel to pry it free. A beadwork band, the sort worn around a cradle board. Blue and white and yellow. A small sun worked right at the center. The fire had licked the edges, but hadn't eaten the heart of it. She held it a moment, then slipped it into her canvas roll. Not to keep, to return Dot by the cottonwood. The child fussed. Clara knelt and unwrapped the bundle just enough to check tiny fingers, tiny feet, the rise and fall of a chest. The deerskin was soft and had been lined with a strip of woven cloth. Someone had mixed old ways and new right there at the seam. A small amulet hung at the child's collar, a leather triangle stitched closed. She left it be. "I don't suppose you'll tell me your name," she murmured. The baby answered with a frown that looked, impossibly, like a question. Clara smiled without meaning to. "All right, little one. We'll do without for now." She had no milk to give. She had learned, in the years that came after the fever and the graves on the Platte, to make do. She warmed water in the kettle and crushed a bit of parched corn she carried, then thought better and tossed the mash away too rough for a small stomach. Instead, she let the water cool and wet the corner of a clean rag, letting the infant suck at the cloth. It wasn't much. It was something. Dusk crept into the hollow. The world softened to the color of ash and copper. Clara set a small fire well. Away from the ruins where the ground was bare, ringed it with stone, and fed it slow with sticks broken knee by knee. She hooked the kettle on a greenwood crotch and brewed willow bark tea for her hand. It would help with the ache. From the berry pouch she shook a few into her palm and ate them one by one. A small sweetness that made her feel human again, then mashed 3 between her fingers and touched the juice to the baby's lips. More ritual than remedy. When the stars lifted, the plains spread out wide and quiet around her. Coyotes sang far off, that lonely stitch of sound that made night feel both bigger and less empty. Clara wrapped the baby against her chest inside her coat, snug and high so she could feel every breath. She leaned her back to the cottonwood and slid down until the roots made a chair of sorts. With the cabin gone and the yard scattered, the place had lost its shape. It felt like a mouth missing teeth. Clara looked to the hills, the low, folded line of them in the starlight, and thought about the beadwork band and the amulet and the careful seam inside the deerskin. People belonged to people. Someone would come. Maybe they were out on a hunt. Maybe they'd left the child sleeping while they fetched water. Maybe a coal had popped, or a pot had boiled dry, or wind had worried a spark into something that grew teeth. Or maybe it wasn't an accident at all. She'd seen how men in town looked at families who didn't match the order they liked to keep. She'd seen a sheriff's smile cut a little wide, a little thin, when he said a thing was settled and you knew it wasn't. She didn't know what had lit that roof. She knew fire didn't care about reasons. The baby stirred, rooting at the cloth. Clara hummed, a tune with no words she couldn't place. Maybe it had belonged to someone else once. The sound settled her as much as it settled him. He quieted, cheek warm against her ribs. The goat dozed by the creek, legs folded, chin tucked, a shape like a rock that breathed. She slept in pieces, waking to feed the small mouth a few drops, to add a stick to the fire, to lift her head and listen with the kind of listening that happens all over your skin. Once the horse smell reached her sweat and leather and the powder-dry scent of a trail, but it was only a dream straying in from an old morning. Once an owl loosed a soft question above the cottonwood, and the baby answered it with a sigh. Near dawn, the wind came back, gentle this time, bringing the faintest trace of wood smoke from some other far-off place, where someone else was boiling coffee or smudging a camp against mosquitoes. The eastern sky paled at the edges, then gathered itself into a thin stripe of gold. The cabin, or what had been the cabin, lay under a skin of ash. A curl of steam rose from the wet edge, where she'd thrown buckets until her arms shook. Clara stood and rolled her sore shoulders. She stretched her burned hand in the cool air and found it would open and close without too much complaint. She tested the weight of the bundle on her chest. The child woke and blinked up at her, solemn now. No tears left. She touched a finger to his palm, and he closed his hand around it, grasped firm as a promise. "All right," she said into the morning that had more questions than answers. "We'll wait today." And then she didn't finish. She didn't have to. The world would answer in its own way, soon enough. On the far ridge, the first light cut a thin line along the grass heads. In that line, she thought she saw movement. Only the wind, she told herself, only the wind combing the prairie. She knelt and fed the fire one last sliver of wood, then kicked dirt over it until it sighed out. The kettle she slung back on its hook. The goat she tethered closer to water. She lifted her face to the hills, eyes narrowed against the light. "Come find us," she said softly, not sure if she meant kin or trouble, salvation or the other thing. "Come and let it be the first." The baby made a small sound like agreement, or sleep pulling him under again. Clara set her back to the cottonwood and waited while the sun, patient and certain, climbed the first hand width above the earth. The sun rose pale and watery, spilling thin light over the hollow. It painted the charred cabin in long shadows, black timbers lying broken like ribs at some great carcass. Clara stirred from her uneasy rest beneath the cottonwood. Her back ached from the roots. Her burned hand stiffened overnight until it felt like leather stretched too tight. The baby woke before she did. His cry was soft at first, then sharp, insistent, as if he knew the morning held questions no one wanted to answer. Clara unwrapped him, checked his limbs and belly for burns, and found him whole. She exhaled slow relief, but relief didn't put food in a child's mouth. She looked to the goat, cropping weeds by the creek. "Well, looks like you're our salvation, old girl." The goat blinked, chewed, and gave no argument. Clara knelt, coaxed it close, and with awkward hands tried milking into her kettle. It had been years since she'd tried such a thing back in Kansas, before the cholera took her folks and sent her walking west alone. The streams of milk came slow, but they came, and she laughed once in spite of herself. She dipped a rag, let the baby suckle the damp end. It wasn't enough, but it calmed him. Better than berries, she told him, though the pouch of scorched fruit still sat beside her, nearly empty now. Better than nothing. The cabin, meanwhile, told its Story poorly. Clara paced the ruin, eyes picking over the black skeleton of the home. She found the iron hinges of the door, a skillet bent from heat, the cracked bottom of a jug. In the ashes near the hearth, she uncovered a woman's hair comb, its carved wood blackened. But there were no bones, no bodies. That troubled her. More than anything, had the owners escaped? Had they been taken? Or had someone set the blaze after harm was already done? Clara chewed her lip. She had grown used to slipping through life like a shadow. She knew how to keep questions to herself. But a baby was no shadow, and she could not pretend away the danger. Whoever the child belonged to would want him back. And if the wrong hands found her first settlers with suspicion in their eyes, or men in town hungry for trouble, they'd call her a thief. Or worse. The morning stretched, the light sharpening, shadows shrinking. Clara walked to the ridge above the hollow, carrying the baby close. From there she could see the land roll. Wide, plains dotted with scrub, the creek curling like a ribbon of silver. To the east lay the wagon trail. To the west, open hills. She whispered to the child, "I could take you east. Find a fort, hand you over. Let them sort it out." But even as she spoke, she pictured stern officers, settlers eager to keep the baby as a curiosity or send him far from his people. Clara knew what it was to be torn loose from belonging. She would not hand that fate to him if she could help it. She shifted her gaze west to the hills. The baby's people were out there. They would come by midday. Buzzards circled overhead, lazy black silhouettes against the sun. Clara drew water from the creek, doused the last smoking beams of the cabin. She worked without thinking, as if tidying the ruin might keep fear at bay. When the baby finally slept against her shoulder, she sat on the log near the ashes and let memory carry her. She thought of her mother's voice singing in the Kansas, dusk of her father's hands guiding hers as she sewed a tear in his shirt. She thought of the fever that took them both, how the neighbors sent her away, saying they had mouths enough to feed. That was when the road became her only kin. Now, for the first time in years, someone clung to her as if she mattered. The sound of hoofbeats broke the quiet. Faint at first, then clearer, 3 riders on the ridge above, their ponies sure-footed on the slope. Clara's breath caught. She ducked into the brush, clutching the baby tight, and peered through the leaves. The riders were not settlers. Their ponies bore paint, manes braided with strips of cloth. The men rode light, with bows and lances at hand. Their hair was long, their faces marked with paint in red and white. One raised his hand, pointing toward the smoke of the burned cabin. Another shaded his eyes, scanning the valley. Clara shrank lower, heart pounding. She could hear her own blood in her ears. The men turned their horses downhill. The brush where Clara hid would not protect her long. She whispered, "Quiet now, little one," though the baby seemed to sense the danger and stayed still as the riders reached the ruins. They dismounted. They moved slowly, like hunters in no rush, eyes sharp. One knelt to touch the ashes. Another picked up the blackened comb Clara had left on the hearthstones. They spoke to each other in voices low and firm. Clara could not understand the words, but she understood the weight. This was their people's loss. The third rider scanned the ground, frowning. He followed the faint path Clara had worn from cabin to cottonwood, cottonwood to creek. He lifted his head sharply, eyes sweeping the brush where she crouched. Breath caught. The baby shifted in her arms, and a single tiny whimper escaped his lips. The rider froze, listening. Then he barked a word, and the others straightened. All 3 turned toward the sound. Clara pressed her back against the earth, clutching the baby close, her heart hammering so loud she thought the whole valley must hear. They were coming, and she had no plan. The night after the riders came down to the cabin was a long one. Clara didn't dare sleep. She carried the baby into the trees along the creek, farther from the ruin, and hid beneath a tangle of willow and chokecherry. The baby stirred at every noise, his breath hitching against her collarbone, but he did not cry. Clara wondered if even infants could feel the weight of danger on the air. She kept watch by starlight. Owls called across the valley. Once she saw the faint glow of torches by the ruins and heard the low, rhythmic chant of men speaking words she could not understand. They were searching, she knew, but whether for enemies or for her, she could not guess. She pressed her paw over the baby's back and willed herself to be still as stone. When dawn came at last, the sky blushed with gray and pink. Clara rose from hiding and crept up a slope to see what the day had brought. The sight struck her still. The hills were alive with riders. Across the ridges, stretching farther than she could count, hundreds of warriors sat astride their ponies. Feathers lifted in the morning breeze. Spears glinted in the new sun. Drums sounded once, slow and deep, like a heartbeat magnified by the land itself. Clara counted by tens, then 20s, then gave up. There were not dozens. There were hundreds. She drew the child close, whispering, "We're caught in the middle now, little one." At the valley's center, a small group detached from the greater mass. 5 riders came forward at a walk, their ponies stepping high and proud. One rode ahead of the others, tall and commanding, with a necklace of claws across his chest and his hair bound in a single thick braid down his back. Face was painted with lines of black and white that made his expression unreadable, like stone. Clara had nowhere to go. To run meant arrows. To stay meant discovery. So she squared her shoulders and stepped into the open grass. The riders halted a short distance away. The leader dismounted with measured grace, boots sinking slightly into the dew-heavy grass. He looked at her, then at the child in her arms. "You carry my grandson," he said in slow, accented English. His voice was deep, carrying across the hush of the valley. Clara's mouth went dry. "I pulled him from the fire," she managed. "The cabin burned. There was no one else. He'd have died if I hadn't taken him." The leader studied her with an expression that gave nothing away. Behind him, the other riders waited, their hands never straying far from bows and lances. All around the valley, the army of warriors held still, watching. The baby stirred and gave a small cry, reaching out a hand as if sensing something familiar. Chief stepped forward. His eyes softened for the briefest moment as he took in the child's face. Then he stretched out his arms. "He is my blood." Clara hesitated. Every instinct in her screamed to cling tighter, to protect the small life she had guarded through fire and fear. But she had not saved the child for herself. She loosened her hold and placed the bundle carefully into the chief's waiting arms. Baby quieted instantly, nestling against the broad chest as if he knew where he belonged. A sound rose from the hills then. It began as a low murmur, then grew into a rolling cry that thundered across the valley. Hundreds of voices joined together, fierce and mournful, until the very air shook. Clara staggered under the force of it. It was not the cry of battle. It was grief. The chief lifted his grandson high for all to see. The warriors answered with another roar, a sound that sent shivers up Clara's spine. She understood then. The fire had taken more than a cabin. It had taken a daughter, a mother, a wife. The baby was all that remained. When the cries quieted, the chief turned to her once more. His eyes were sharp now, demanding. "You saw the fire?" "Yes," Clara said, her voice barely steady. "I saw the smoke. I went inside. The baby was alone. The roof was falling in. I had to run." The chief regarded her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, as if weighing her words against the child's survival. "You saved him. For that, you live." The words fell like a verdict. Relief swept through Clara, but fear lingered. She was not yet safe. She was in the middle of something vast and dangerous. The chief mounted again, holding his grandson close. "Come," he ordered. "You will walk with us." Clara swallowed hard, her burned hand throbbing, her legs heavy with dread. Yet she followed as the riders turned back toward the waiting hills. Behind them, the host of 500 warriors shifted, their ponies stamping the earth in restless unison. And Clara realized the truth. The world she had known, of drifting alone through dust and hunger, was gone. She was no longer walking her own path. She had stepped into theirs. The warriors moved as one body, a living tide flowing toward the hills. Clara stumbled after the chief's horse, her boots sliding in the trampled grass. The baby rode against his grandfather's chest, small hand gripping a claw from the old man's necklace, eyes half shut with weariness. Clara's arms felt strange without the weight of him, as though she'd left a piece of herself behind. The march was slow but steady. Warriors peeled off in pairs to scout the ridges. Others rode flank with lances upright, their shadows cutting long across the land. The air carried the thrum of hooves, the whisper of feathers, the occasional low call between men. It was not a war party's rage, but a people's vigilance. An escort for Grief Dot. As the company crested the hilltop, Clara saw the encampment. Hundreds of tipis rose in neat circles, their painted hides bright against the dry earth. Bison, eagles, zigzag, lightning. Fires smoked thin spirals into the sky. Horses grazed in herds beyond, and children played near the edge of the camp until they saw the column approach. Then the children ran, voices shrill with news. The chief had returned. The child had been found. The tribe gathered swiftly. Women came forward, some with braids threaded in beads, some with plain dresses smudged with ash. The moment the chief dismounted and held the baby aloft, cries broke from the crowd. Some women fell to their knees, wailing. Others pressed their hands to their faces. Clara stood at the edge of the gathering, her heart tight. A young man stepped from the throng, his shoulders broad, his face set like a blade. His gaze fell first on the child, then on Clara, and something fierce lit in his eyes. He spoke to the chief in rapid words Clara could not follow, his voice taut as a bowstring. The chief answered calmly, holding the child with care. The younger man clenched his fists, then strode away, grief shaking him. Clara understood without words. The child's father. The chief turned to her at last. He lifted one hand, calling for silence. The voices died until only the wind moved through the grass. "She is the one who carried my grandson from the fire," he said in his language, but slowly, so the words might reach even her. He placed his hand over his heart, then gestured to her. Without her, he would be ashes. A murmur swept through the camp, half gratitude, half suspicion. Clara felt it ripple against her skin. Some eyes softened, others cut sharp. That night, she was given a place near the fire of the women who had lost kin in the burning. They brought her a bowl of corn mush and a robe of soft hide. One woman, older, with hair streaked white, pressed a hand to Clara's shoulder and nodded once, solemn. It was the first kindness she had felt in years that carried weight, not pity. Still, not all welcomed her. When she rose to fetch water, 2 young men laughed low and muttered words she didn't know, but whose edge was plain. Their eyes held. The same question Clara asked herself. Was she truly savior or thief? The baby slept in his grandfather's lodge, but in the morning he fussed and reached for Clara when she passed. The old chief allowed her to take him, and together they sat near the fire while the camp stirred awake. She hummed her mother's tune, rocking him as she had the night of the fire. Other women paused to watch, their suspicion bending into curiosity, then into a kind of quiet approval. Days passed like this. Clara fetched wood, tended small fires, carried water from the creek. She learned the rhythm of the camp, the pounding of hides, the laughter of children, the whisper of prayers spoken into the dawn. She kept close to the baby, who smiled now when she appeared. Slowly, the looks from others softened. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the chief summoned her. They sat by his fire, the baby between them. "You had no people," he said, not asking but declaring. Clara swallowed. "No, now you do." He gestured to the camp, to the wide circle of tipis, for the child gurgling in the dust. "You saved him. That binds you to us?" Her throat tightened. She had lived years on the road, her name drifting away with every town that forgot her. To hear someone speak of belonging, as if it were hers by right, that was a gift she had never dreamed. To receive the chief leaned close. "This boy will grow, and he will need many hands. You will be one of them. Remember this. A child has many mothers when a people are strong." The firelight painted his face in gold and shadow. Clara felt the weight of his words settle into her bones. That night, as the stars rose bright and sharp, she lay on her borrowed robe and listened to the breathing of the camp around her, the steady, human sound of a people at rest. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like a stray leaf on the wind. The prairie stretched vast and silent beyond the camp. Tomorrow might bring questions, dangers, or sorrow. But tonight she belonged, and the baby, saved from fire, slept safe within a circle of kin, his tiny hand clutching her finger even in dreams.